Welcome to this video where we'll go over some of the physical attributes of my style of my playing, especially a lot of the smaller details, those sort of lesser known tricks and whatnot that I do. And that'll be the focus, those lesser known ones, the ones that are more integral to my playing rather than, more general, somewhat common knowledge physical tricks. Before we get into some of the smaller details and tricks, let's do a sort of brief overview of the fundamental parts of how my hands move in my style. So first, the left hand position is usually something like this, where I'm covering all the strings, or most of the strings, usually done with the index or middle finger, as those are sort of the most dominant fingers of my left hand. They sort of lead the hand, as we'll talk about. Now, the reason it's super important to cover all your strings is because I'm playing on an 8 string, of course. So noise control is much more important on an 8 string than a 6 string. And it's much harder to do all of it with your right hand, which means usually your left hand is going to have to do more work than it would on a 6 string. And that's where this sort of position comes in. So the good thing about this position is you can have the index and middle covering the strings while your ring and pinky are sort of free to move. You could also move the middle finger down as well. And you could also swap, so the middle finger is covering the strings and then your 3 other fingers are ready to move. Now, another note about this position is that I usually tilt my hand a bit this way. Obviously not this much, I'm just exaggerating. It's usually just a small tilt. And that's mainly because if you look at your finger length, obviously your index finger is slightly shorter than your middle finger, which means to sort of even that out, I like to tilt a little bit. And this also has the added benefit of giving you a bit of like leverage for when you're doing hammer-ons with these other fingers. It gives you a bit more leverage so you can get a bit more power behind the hammer-ons. And that's super important when it comes to the high strings because, of course, it's much more difficult to get a loud hammer-on sound on the high strings compared to the low strings. Last thing to mention about the left hand is that sort of middle finger and index finger dominance, like I mentioned. They sort of lead the hand a lot of the time. And that's for a couple different reasons. So first off, if you play a heavy hammer-on sort of tap style, you know that these positions with the middle finger at the lowest string of a chord or the index finger are much easier to get into position and to get a strong sound out of. So when you're playing a heavy two-handed sort of tapping style, etc., whatever you want to call it, you're usually going to be relying on those sort of chords that the index finger or middle finger are on the bass string much more for those reasons. Now, another piece of that is that, especially on an 8 string, again, when you're raising your pinky finger to the low strings, you have to raise it a extraordinary amount. Especially because if we look at our finger length again, our pinky is way shorter than all our other fingers. Like the difference between your middle finger and your ring and index is nothing compared to the difference between your pinky and your other fingers. So when you're raising your pinky to the lowest strings, you have to go a crazy amount of distance. So on a 8 string especially, that's not really viable most of the time, at least when you're doing quick changes. So if you want to get your pinky up onto the low strings, you're usually going to be doing it over like a series of smaller changes rather than a huge leap. And the same thing goes for the ring finger. Although the ring is longer than the pinky, it's still quite a hassle to get it onto the lowest strings quickly. As for the right hand, there's not much to talk about in terms of these sort of general aspects of its position and motion. So all I'll mention is that, like most styles, I try to just focus on sort of having fluid, efficient motion, meaning more sort of circular, I think of it, rather than more abrupt, angular, stop and go sort of motion. So this applies especially for when we're switching between ways of playing, because of course I try to have fluid transitions between, finger picking and tapping, for instance. So if you're like finger picking, do a percussive element, and then continue those percussive elements onto the tapping. So you can see how the motion of your individual fingers and your entire hand and wrist and arm even come together to make the motion fluid. So you have to be thinking about this, of course, as you're going about your playing. Now, to get into a specific example, let's talk about tapping for a little bit. So oftentimes when you're learning tapping, the sort of basic general advice you hear is to pull the string towards you. Now, this is good general advice. However, obviously, it can get a lot more complicated than that when you get into the details. A lot of the times, it makes sense in terms of fluidity of motion and, some other factors to push the string away from you. So oftentimes I try to just think of this in my head. I almost think of it like alternate picking. So for instance, if you look at the motion here, I'll just tap the same note over and over, but I'll swap between pushing away and pulling toward me. So you can see the motion there is like alternate picking, and it's circular rather than a stop and go sort of. And also it uses my entire hand and wrist, which is another thing to mention, that when you're playing fast, a lot of this stuff about keeping your motion, especially for tapping, it changes. The rules are a lot different. When you're tapping fast, it usually makes more sense to stick to the same, pulling the string towards you. However, when we're not playing that fast, which is usually you're not going to be at like the limits of your speed, we can do these more streamlined, more efficient motions. And this also relates back to what I was saying about transitioning between ways of playing, because if you're mixing in your tapping with percussive elements, there's obviously a lot more motion going on there with your hand and your wrist as a whole. You can't just be moving your fingers like if you're just tapping, how you can only focus on the fingers, which means that you need to be thinking about both of these parts in your tapping, both of these parts of your motion, the fingers and the hand/wrist itself. So another example we'll do here. So on the first note, I'm pushing away from me and then toward me. And now we have an option. So as you can see, if my hand goes past the next string, I now have the option of going back and again pushing away. However, if I control that motion and I don't push the entire hand past the next string, then I can continue the motion toward me and do that for the next tap as well. So this is almost like economy picking, this option, rather than alternate. So we go push away, toward. I'm exaggerating there, but you get the idea. We're trying to keep the momentum going from the different taps. So you can see when you get into the specifics of different situations, the rules of what makes economic motion, fluid motion, etc., they change. So you have to be thinking about this, taking this into consideration beforehand, so you can get it all right as you're, playing slowly, and then it's good for when you bring it up to speed. Now, the last little thing to mention about this, the last advantage, so to speak, of getting comfortable with pushing the string away from you, is that it just gives you more options in terms of tone, texture, etc. Like if you wanted to tap on the second string and then pull away while also hitting the highest string, you could do that. Another thing is when you're tapping on the highest string and you're pushing away from you, you have the advantage that there's no strings in the way, which means that the arc that your finger travels as it's pushing away can be completely different. It's like the advantage you have when you're tapping on the lowest string and pulling towards you. I mean, you can push extremely hard, you can change the way that you do the motion, etc. So the same thing applies on the high string, of course, as you're pushing the string away from you. The last thing about tapping to mention is that you should learn to use your right hand thumb to do tapping. And it's for a couple of reasons. First off, it opens a few opportunities in terms of switching quickly between hitting notes and tapping, of course, since the thumb is, in position. And also that thing I just did there is a sort of trick you can do when you're using the thumb like this, where you sort of tap and then pluck the note really quickly. So obviously I'm exaggerating there, doing it slowly so you can see, but you know, when you do it faster, especially with a muted string, doing that very quickly can create a quite cool sound. And of course, there's a lot of other benefits to being able to use your thumb for tapping. So for instance, if you're the rest of your hand is in a position where it would otherwise be impossible to do something, then obviously your thumb can save you by being that extra finger there. And also in terms of fluidity of motion and speed even, oftentimes the thumb can be in a better state to help your other fingers than any of the other right hand fingers could be. So that's all situational, of course, but just be aware that that thumb can come in handy if you teach it to tap. Now let's touch on finger picking of the right hand specifically, especially the ways that you can change your tone and texture. Now, oftentimes when you talk about the right hand and changing tone, texture, etc., the main thing that people talk about is moving it along the strings to get a different sound, etc., that sort of stuff. However, there's a ton of different alterations you can make to how you're plucking to your fingers specifically to change the tone and texture. So of course these can be big ones, like for instance completely changing and doing a sort of bass motion to pluck. Of course that would get you a completely different sound. Another common one of course you hear is changing how much nail versus flesh touches the string. However, I'd like to touch on the way that you pluck specifically with the finger, these sort of small changes. So for instance, the angle is one thing. It can be angled like this, or angled more like this, like a flamenco sort of angle. Then another thing is how upward, like this, are you plucking versus sort of towards you, or towards your finger, more of like a classical way of plucking. Those are big changes. And another thing to mention here is that I use my pinky a lot in my finger picking, which is a bit unusual. So of course this can open up opportunities, like for instance, if your ring finger has just been used on, as you can see, my B string, my third string here, then I want to play the high E. I don't have to do some like weird motion to get in position there, or like use the index stretched across like that. You can just use the pinky. But what I really want to talk about is the tone and texture thing, as I mentioned. So one thing I do with my nails is I keep the nail on my pinky finger sort of a different shape and size than my other fingers, so that this gives me a sort of different option there to get a different tone on certain notes with the pinky. This is amplified by the fact that when you have your hand in sort of finger picking position, your pinky is sort of at a completely different angle and also position than your other fingers. So it's much more to the right, much closer to the sort of saddle here compared to your other fingers, which means that it will get a completely different tone than your other fingers in terms of your, you know, where you are along the strings. And also, as I mentioned, the angle as well is changed because of that, which means that, again, it will change the tone. And you can even amplify that I'm exaggerating here again, but you can really amplify that and change the distance between your fingers to make the pinky even more to the right. Which brings me to another thing, is that with these changes in your hand, when you're just changing the angle and stuff like that, it can also change the distance between your fingers, which means that the, you know, relationship between them of where they are along the strings is going to change. And so they'll get different tone in terms of that variable there. So altogether, all these things can be taken into consideration when you're thinking about the tone you're getting with your finger picking. The main thing is when you're playing slow to keep in mind the different adjustments you can make and think about what specific tone you want for a specific note or whatever, and then, you know, implement the change. Also, I forgot to mention this earlier, when you're tapping, the way that your nail is shaped and the size of it and all that can, of course, change your tone, your texture as you're pulling off of the string. And you can also, you know, make alterations to this based on the way that you pull off, the arc that you take, etc., that sort of stuff. Now, another little trick I'd like to bring to attention here is plucking strings with your left hand. So this is a sort of known thing, of course, but I'd like to mention a few stranger ways of doing it. So the basic sort of ways, of course, is if we have our hand in this basic position, as I mentioned earlier, where we're covering the strings, well, our pinky is sort of the prime candidate for doing this, especially on the high strings there. It can easily, do a pluck. However, if we have the middle finger dominating the left hand position, our index becomes super good for those higher strings. Now, for weirder ways of doing it, we can sort of mix it in with our hammer-ons and pull-offs sort of stuff. So if I'm doing, now I want to pull off this middle finger, I could at the same time hit either the strings above or below it. Now, of course, you could even, take this a step further and actually be holding a note for the other strings as well, rather than open. Or another thing you could do is hit multiple, or more than two strings, at the same time. Staggered it there a bit, but you get the idea. So the last thing to mention about this is that if you are, an improv bass guitarist like me, then of course you might be a bit worried that you'll mess this up, because it often requires extremely precise movements, especially if you're not super practiced in it, which most people who are not literal one-handed guitarists are not that practiced in using that, fretting hand to strum or to hit notes or whatever. So that means that one thing you can sort of do is, as a safety net, is just to tap or hammer on the note and then pull off super quickly, and sort of use that as a safety net in case you're worried about accidentally hitting the fret. Well, you can just hit the fret, but do it extremely quickly, and it's kind of like you plucked it without hitting the fret. So you have that safety net available to you. Now, obviously, there's way more depth, way more options than this when it comes to strumming and etc. with this hand. So if you're interested in that, in the description, I'll put a link to a channel of a guy who only has one hand, and so obviously he has much more refined techniques, options available to him, etc., all that when it comes to this sort of thing. Let's go into some of my stranger percussive techniques, because of course this style is pretty inspired by one-man band sort of players on acoustic guitar, like Poello, Gans, Mike Dawes, Marcin. However, they of course have the acoustic guitar to do percussive elements with, so I kind of had to come up with some different, stranger ways of getting percussive sounds out of the electric guitar. Now let's go over some. So the first sort of big common one I do is tapping on the strings with the right hand and sort of flat-ish fingers. So there's a lot of different stuff you can do in terms of the rhythms, since you have all your fingers available to you, but also the power, because of course you could hit your entire palm at the same time, and that sort of thing. Now, the main thing you have to take into consideration when you're doing this, though, is that of course it's a quite awkward position when you compare it to finger picking. Like, the switch there is pretty difficult, pretty big, which means that you have to sort of make it fluid, which of course you'll notice that it's a similar position to tapping, the way that your fingers are sort of stretched out like that, which means that usually I sort of use tapping combined with this and combined with other percussive elements to do the transition between finger picking and this hand position. So the thumb, especially percussive elements with the thumb, often can work as that transition. So you're finger picking, then thumb hit. At the same time, I've extended my fingers, I'm ready to do something, whatever. So that's the main sort of methods I have for keeping stuff fluid with this specific technique. Now, another slightly strange one is using the back of the thumb. Nothing really too complicated to it, it just has a strange sort of sound to it. Now, let's talk about left-hand percussion, because this is something I've worked on, but I still have a lot more ways to go with it. It's quite a complex topic, again, just like plucking and strumming with the left hand. So the main thing I like to do is sort of just gently tap the tops of the strings. So if you do this in a certain way, you can even do it with force and quickly without fretting the notes. And so you can sort of retain a percussive sound. Now also, of course, I'm doing this on the low strings mainly because it's it fits better there. Let's just simplify by saying that. But you can also do it on high strings, although it gets much harder to do it without hitting notes. And it's quieter, of course. It takes much more difficulty to get the sound coming when you do it that way. Now, of course, you can do the same motions with your right hand. Of course, again, it gets much more difficult to do it without hitting a note, although you can also just hit notes on purpose as you're doing it for a specific sound. And strangely enough, with the right hand, it's kind of easier to do the high strings without getting much notes, just because of the way that the fingers, are curved there and everything. So there's a lot of intricacies, a lot of specific details, again, to how you do this sort of technique. But the great thing about it is that since we usually have the left hand in this sort of position, it means that our fingers are usually available to do it on the left hand. And also, you can do it with just the index and middle finger, which is useful because, as I said, this sort of position, as I'm doing right now, is very useful, where your ring and pinky are doing high string stuff, and then these two are on the low strings, and then on your right hand, you could go in the, sort of in between the middle strings with your thumb, and then your other fingers on the higher strings. Which brings me to a sort of common position I like to do, which, as I said, your thumb on the right hand is sort of in the middle-ish strings, and then you use your primarily index and middle on the lowest strings for the left hand. So this it opens up a lot of opportunities because, of course, the way you can use your thumb on your right hand is quite different than you can use your other fingers on it. You can use it to do sort of like tremolo style picking, so to speak, or, thumping sort of stuff. But you can do a lot of techniques that don't work as well on the two lowest strings. A lot of techniques that you can do with your thumb specifically work much better on sort of these middle-ish strings, which means that this sort of position where you let your left hand do the lowest strings and the thumb on the middle strings means you can employ these sort of techniques that are better on these specific strings and get a sound that way. Let's take a look at this sort of position work in action. Notice how I'm able to keep multiple more percussive sounds going on, as well as the bass part and the sort of high string melody, if you want to call it that, at the same time. Though I'd just call it more like texturing, but anyway. So you get the idea, hopefully. As you can see, though, with this sort of position, it can be quite difficult to do more intricate stuff on the higher strings. That's sort of one of the weaknesses of it because of how important it is for your left hand to be kept in this position. Also, I'd like to mention, when I say noise control, I literally mean the specific sounds, the noises coming out of the guitar. I don't mean it in like the traditional way of noise, as in unwanted sounds, unwanted strings that you aren't muting, making sound, that sort of stuff. I mean in a more general, broad way of the literal sounds coming out of the guitar and controlling those sounds how you want. Let's talk about the noise control specifics for a little bit, because it's actually extremely important to the style, the way of playing as a whole. And a lot of that relies on the sound of your open strings, because of course a lot of the alterations you're going to make will, depend on what your open string is. If I have my left hand here around the first fret versus the, third fret, I can get a completely different percussive sound there. And of course, the main part of that, the sort of like note-ish sounding part of that, is dependent on your open string, which means that we could use capos, for instance, to, very quickly get a completely different sound while not really changing how we play. And that's because because of the way we play, especially the percussive elements, but also some other stuff that depend on the open string sound, that means that the sort of background of our playing, if you think of it like a painting, the background is the open strings essentially. It doesn't have to be, but it often is with this sort of playing. So you have to be aware of that at all times, and that's why the capo can, so quickly change our sound completely. Now, as for more specific ways that you can, change these sort of percussive elements sound and do that with noise control, is, for instance, the distance between your finger and the string, your finger and the fret, would change it a lot. So this is kind of like what you do when you do a harmonic, and you're trying to get that, specific distance. I mean, the same thing applies here. So obviously the closer you are to the string, the more you're going to mute it, but also you run the risk of actually getting the note out. Another thing you could do is using multiple fingers versus using just one finger to mute a string. So obviously the more fingers you have on there, the more it's going to be muted generally, get a more percussive sound there, less of a note. And that's mainly in the way of percussive sounds, and specifically the left hand muting. So if we do the right hand, for instance, we're just, let's say, plucking muted notes, you can again do stuff like very lightly raise that finger. So I'm kind of at the height right now of which, you'd be getting a natural harmonic if this was a harmonic fret. And the sound is different than if I let my hand rest completely down on them. It's much deeper now versus when I raise it. It sounds almost a bit more metallic. So again, these are just the ways to change the percussive sound of it. Now, how about noise control in, our other ways of playing? The main thing I'd like to touch on for our other noise control is how the specific ways that you move your hands affect it. So for instance, if I'm just hammering on this low note here, if I hammer it on like that, I mean, it just sounds like the note. If you hammer it on super, super loudly, it completely changes the sound. It gets more percussive, especially because I have the mic. Usually when I'm recording, I have both DI and a mic on. So the mic, of course, will pick up more of that sound of your finger just hitting the fretboard there. So that'll make it more percussive in and of itself. And also it even gets a bit of fret buzz in there, which if you want that, could be good. So the same thing applies for like tapping, for instance. If I do it hard, you hear the fretboard hit as well. So you can change the texture specifically of your playing by doing stuff like that. Which brings us to another point, which is you don't actually have to mute everything you're doing in this sort of playing. Because, as you can hear there, because when the open strings are used, as I said before, they serve as the background. So when people listen to you playing a lot with open strings, they get used to that. They get used to those sounds being noisy. They get used to those open strings being the background, which means they don't notice them as much. They don't, get in the way as much of the other stuff you're doing. So you can leave them ringing, much more openly. The last thing I'd like to touch on is just these tiny adjustments you can make in the way that you play. And it sort of comes down a lot to not restricting yourself from doing certain stuff that, might seem bad or unwanted at first glance. Like, for instance, when you're playing a note and then you lift your finger, you can purposely get the fret to buzz as a intentional change in the texture. So, here's clean versus with the buzz. And also, as you can see, I'm doing this in two ways. I'm doing it by one, raising my finger from the fret much more slowly. And two, I'm sort of fretting badly, so to speak. I'm fretting way, way away from the fret. So there's, a ton of different ways that you can do these tiny little adjustments in your playing to change your tone and texture, change the noise control, etc. So another one I'd like to mention for tapping, for instance, if you're doing a tap harmonic, you could, you just change where you're tapping very slightly to completely change the tone. So usually when you're doing a tap harmonic, you try to tap where the fret is on the literal like metal part of the fret, but you could, move that little bit away from the fret and it would completely change the tone. So as you can see, I'm still getting a sort of sound there, sort of 12th fret harmonic sound there, but it's completely different to actually doing it on the 12th fret. So again, something that you'd initially think is sort of unwanted, undesired sound, but you can use it to your advantage in, specific situations. Or again, if you're an improv player, these sort of mistakes even will happen. Like, sometimes you'll miss the fret by a little bit when you're doing a tap harmonic. But if you notice that and notice the specific change in sound it makes to what you just did, you can then adapt, change what you play afterwards to make it sound like that initial mistake was on purpose, and these sort of things. Maybe even change the story, the whole of the song because of something like that, whatever it may be. Now, all that being said though, the main thing here I want you to just remember is that these tiny changes in the movements of your fingers completely change how stuff sound. And you need to keep that in mind to get the sounds you want out of your guitar. With all this noise control stuff in mind, let's talk about the hammer-on tapping part of it because of how important that is to our playing style. So traditionally, if you're doing something like hammer 3, hammer 5, you do it as one sort of continuous motion there. However, you can make a ton of tiny changes to this. For instance, a thing I like to do a lot is to sort of create a gap between those notes, so you get a percussive sound on both notes rather than just the first one. Now there's a lot of small modifications you can do there, like the gap between the two notes. You could increase for even more of a separation between the notes, or you could decrease it to sort of hint at a bit of a connection, but also a bit of separation. There's, again, a lot of small movements you can do with your fingers to alter this sort of stuff. Now another thing is when you're doing that hammer on stuff, you can very lightly hit some of the other strings to get a bit more texture going on. So something like that where you're even hammering on that other one for just a second and then letting it go. Now, all this stuff that I've mentioned so far can also be applied to your tapping. So you can do that separation thing. And you can also, tap multiple strings at the same time and stuff like that for changes in texture. But all this I've said about this hammer on tap stuff, it all comes back again to this idea of just making tiny differences in the motion of our fingers and hand and that to get these changes going. That's sort of the core of what I want to hammer in here. Because oftentimes when we think about making changes in tone and that, we think about it in very limited terms, like, as I mentioned earlier, for instance, with your right hand, where along the strings it is, that sort of stuff. But really, every single motion you do has an opportunity to change the sound or, do what you want to it, really. So we have to keep all this in mind as guitarists to get the sound we want, because that's the core of it, getting the sound we want. Now let's close out this video with talking a little bit about how you actually come across and learn these stranger, more unknown tricks. But first, I'd like to mention that I don't really think this is something you should focus too much on. I think it should just happen naturally for the most part, because it generally is not very efficient in terms of your improvement and your skill as a musician as a whole. The amount of time that you put into these things versus the results it's not a great ratio, which means, in my opinion, you should not really focus on it unless you've noticed specifically that the physical parts you're playing, especially these sort of tricks, is, super underdeveloped. Then at that state, it could definitely be worth spending the time. All that being said, let's get into it. So the first big method is learning from other great players, whether it's watching them play, watching an educational video of them, or maybe even getting some sort of live coaching or whatever. Pretty much all great players are going to have a ton of tricks you can learn and implement into your own playing because they have the experience, of course, and they've come across so many different tricks. Another thing is just accidents. Oftentimes you make a mistake as you're playing, and then that one thing leads to another, and you realize something. that could be useful. Lastly, it can be a sort of problem-solving response, a sort of solution you find to, you know, problems you're having in your playing. So that's where the thumb tapping thing came in for me. I was, you know, doing my tapping, whatever, and then I found myself in a position with my other fingers where, for whatever reason, it wasn't really convenient to use any of the other fingers, so I just began using the thumb. And all this is just generalizing, of course. You know, really finding these sort of tricks can be a much more complicated process, but it's generally best if it happens naturally either way. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Any questions, ask away. Goodbye.